All right, are we ready to jump in? All right, I just wanted to make sure everybody could hear me okay. All right, well, thank you for coming back, right? We tried to scare you this morning with the content that we had, but hopefully that went okay. I really love the chat aspect of this and how everybody's getting a chance to talk, even though we're prevented from being in the same room. That part's working pretty well. We're going to have to make some adjustments on the fly in our next session, but in this session, we're going to talk about Windows MDM at FileWave. And to do so, Dave Elliott is joining me. Many of you probably know Dave. He's our VP of Engineering. And sorry. Dave's our VP of Engineering, and he'll be joining in. We're going to do basically a 20-minute presentation here. You can ask questions throughout in the chat. We probably won't get to them because we're reserving the last 10 minutes of this 30 minutes to talk about any questions that you may have. So we have about 15, 20 minutes worth of kind of talking points, but hopefully it'll answer a lot of questions about Windows MDM. And then we can talk about your questions. And then right after this, we've got another session. Then that's a half hour where we're going to be talking about some best practice stuff. So let's jump right in and talk about Windows MDM at FileWave. So the first question you may be asking, and I would be asking if I were in your shoes, is why do you want Windows MDM at all? You have FileWave already, and you can manage lots of things with it. Why is Windows MDM helpful? And it's a good question. It's a pertinent question. We get a lot from FileWave for Windows, but Windows MDM actually provides us some extra things. It gives us automated management integration right out of the box. So basically, you have automated enrollment with the Microsoft solution. It's called Autopilot. And Autopilot, we'll go into some terms later, but you can think of Autopilot as the DEP equivalent from Microsoft. Right? So that's the DEP equivalent. We've got automatic pre-configured FileWave client distribution through this too. So when a device comes in through Autopilot, it's automatically through an MDM command going to get the FileWave client distributed to it. And for those of you who are used to managing Apple devices, you're going to realize that this model looks very much the same as we get with macOS devices on the Apple side. We also get integration with Microsoft Azure specific functions such as BitLocker key escrow. Right? So we'll be able to talk about that here in a little bit. And it also enables what I refer to as non-imaging imaging, which is very much like the Apple model. Instead of actually imaging a device, you kick it back into an out-of-box experience. It's actually a little more nimble on the Microsoft side because you don't have to erase and reinstall the device. It's a reset using a tool called Autopilot Reset. And that allows the device to come back in to FileWave right away and pick up things and maybe get out of the business of having to maintain Windows images. Windows MDM also has the option, of course, we can deploy Office 365 apps as well, but it's kind of simple to do with Windows MDM, and we can do Windows Store apps as well. Kind of the last couple of things here on the Windows MDM front. You've got configuration profiles, which are referred to as CSPs. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And compliance policies. So if then kind of stuff. If my device is good, then it can get to other applications. So those are also part of this framework as well. And then lastly, there's better Windows Update Management available through Windows MDM. So with all of those things, and that's a pretty good list of things, you may be asking yourself, well, why FileWave? If I'm going to do Windows MDM, why do I need FileWave then? And I can almost guarantee that our salespeople are saying, what, Tony, why'd you say that? But it's a good question, right? From your perspective, why FileWave along with Windows MDM? It's a good question. It's an honest question, but there's a good answer to it too. And that the Windows MDM framework is a little different from the Apple framework. Apple simply provides the framework and they say, hey, here's the MDM framework. You go find a vendor to work with to do MDM. Microsoft kind of did the same thing. They created the framework, but then they said as well, but if you don't have a provider, an MDM provider, well, we've got a product too. And their product is called Intune, which you may have heard of. So they've got the framework and the product, and other vendors can work with the framework, FileWave being one of them. But that framework plus our FileWave client, and we're looking at this as a hybrid mode implementation, means that we can leverage the strengths of FileWave too. And again, for those of you managing macOS devices, you know how true this is. Because it's the same model. There's still a FileWave client, and it gives us the ability to do things like all the dynamic smart groups, the ability to do application deployments like MSIs and set up the exe types, file set magic, all the self-healing stuff, all the FileWave goodness that you're used to working with. Then the custom fields, like the stuff that we did earlier with production and patch management testing, for instance, with those dynamic smart groups based off a custom field. Those are that's all the FileWave magic and the stuff that FileWave brings to the table. And of course, all the ancillary tools like Observe Client, the more extensive hardware, software inventory, the ability to deploy software if it's missing, all of those types of things we get out of the FileWave side. So the two together are exceptionally complementary. All right. So if you're like me though, right, when I first got involved about a year ago, I guess it was, with Windows MDM, the terms are spectacularly confusing about what pieces are what. And first we're going to talk about Autopilot. And Autopilot confused me forever because I was always combining and confusing Autopilot with Intune. Autopilot is the Microsoft equivalent to Apple's DEP program, right? And again, what's that about? It's about tying a device to your organization. It allows you to say, this device belongs to me. When it gets set up initially, it should check in with me and be managed by me or my organization, right? So it's a way of stamping your identity on those devices. This program is actually a little more flexible than what we have with Apple, because we can kind of inject our own devices in here without necessarily coming from a reseller. Also, although the resellers can get them in there for us too. So there's lots of ways to do that. So Autopilot is a really critical function here, because in fact, I would say it's the most critical function, because it's the thing that makes sure that your devices are managed. The second thing that we're talking about, we mentioned it before, is Autopilot Reset. And that's a command, an MDM command, and it turns out you can do it through a PowerShell script as well, to put a device back to that out-of-box experience. So again, if we consider that there's a device in the field, somebody's been using it, it's Windows 10, and we want to give it to a new person, we don't have to necessarily wipe that device, reinstall the operating system. What we can do is send it this Autopilot Reset, which makes it lose all the applications and the user data and just takes it back to bare Windows like it was when it came out of the box, right? Which then allows the next person to pick it up and start using it fresh. Right? Deployment profiles. Now, you're probably familiar with the concept of deployment profiles, but those are the rules that control the device onboarding experience. One thing that's a little different here is that the framework, the MDM framework from Microsoft, doesn't yet have an open API for managing the deployment profiles. So the management of those will be done through the Microsoft portal. But it's the same basic concept where you assign the profile to the device and then it knows where to go. Part of that being the communication with your FileWave server. A couple more components, right? We've got CSPs. And I'm glad there's an abbreviation for it, because it's short for Configuration Service Provider. You can think of these as the things that are in a GPO previously, but are now deployed through MDM, right? So this is compartmentalizing those, and all this work, and we're going to talk about in a little bit, is ongoing right now. So what you're seeing on the right here is actually a view from our web admin of building one of the profiles, in this case, a restriction profile. Microsoft Endpoint Manager, we should probably mention Microsoft Store for Business as well. This is the tool that you use, kind of the portal, the website portal, for getting access to Intune, to Autopilot, to device enrollment settings, etc. All right, so those are just some, kind of in a nutshell, but the things that are really important there are Autopilot, and understanding what that is I think the main takeaway out of these terms, and CSP is probably too. We already mentioned Intune being Microsoft's MDM solution. Okay, So let's talk a little bit about prerequisites, because there's some things that you have to have in place to use Windows MDM. It's not just I have Windows devices, therefore I can use Windows MDM. There's some stuff that you have to do and own. And nothing makes anybody happier than talking about licensing and infrastructure, but we have to talk about it nonetheless. So required components, very easy to be licensed for the toolset from a FileWave perspective. And you probably already are, because all you have to do is have a computer management license for your managed devices, for your computers, right? We don't double dip. So just because this is Windows MDM doesn't mean that you also need a mobile license for the device. That's not the case. It's just a computer management license, and you already have one of those. And this is, again, very much the same as Mac OS devices that you may be managing if you're managing both platforms, right? So you need that license. From a Microsoft side, studying tax law is probably about as easy as understanding Microsoft licensing. So I'm not going to attempt, and I don't think we'll have anybody from FileWave argue that we need to interpret Microsoft licensing for you, but we'll try to help as best as possible. So I've got a link here in this slide deck, and we'll share the PDF version of this, or I can send you, if you want to email me, I'll send you the link to this page where the snippet on the right is taken from on the Microsoft side about what you need. And it's very difficult for us to answer this because it depends on what you're already licensed for. So for instance, if I look at that list and I say, hey, I'm an enterprise customer and I've got Azure Active Directory in place, I probably need Premium P1 or P2 to be licensed for all the pieces I need that include Autopilot and all the other stuff. And the last piece, sorry about the dog in the background there. And the last piece that you need is a functional Azure AD integration. And that part is required, and sometimes it's maybe a little bit subtle that you need that before you can implement Windows MDM. That includes Okta that we talked about before. Even if you're doing Okta, that has to be federated with your Azure AD to be able to leverage and use Windows MDM. So absolutely must come through Microsoft for that with Azure AD. Okay. So let's talk about kind of how some of the things work, at least. We're going to talk about the initial system setup, and we're going to talk about device enrollment. And this is definitely at a 50,000-foot view, just trying to give you a feel for what's involved. So for the first time system setup, we're going to create a new FileWave MDM app in the Azure AD portal. It's not dissimilar from the app that we have to build actually to do the IDP integration that we talked about before, but basically you're building a new web application. That sounds much more complicated than it is. It's a few clicks and typing in values in a couple of fields. All right, so that's the interface. This application is the interface for the FileWave server to talk to. Sorry, I'm getting feedback because somebody, not me. Sorry. Can you hear me okay now? All right, thank you. So that app is the interface for FileWave to talk to, right? The second thing we're going to do is go ahead and configure FileWave to talk to Azure AD, and we'll do that in our web admin. So we'll give it the information like the client ID, the client secret, et cetera, to be able to be, quote, authorized to talk to that application that we created in that step above. Then we're going to go ahead and take our pre-configured FileWave client and add it to FileWave. And you'll see here that's done in our native interface because it's where we're doing it currently for the macOS client, but it's the same concept, adding that client so that it, the newly enrolled FileWave MDM, Windows MDM device will know where to go, what server to go to. Once that is set up, then devices will be added to Autopilot. Now that's not an automatic procedure. Your resellers can do it. You can do it. You can do it on one-off. You can do it as a mass upload. We're going to talk about a way to do that in a little bit. But it's important to us to get those devices in Autopilot, and I'll cover a scenario later that kind of explains why. So this is the first thing about getting the system set up. But let's talk about what the enrollment process looks like. So on the device enrollment side, both BYOD and Autopilot enrollment are similar enough that I can explain them in the same way here, although there are differences, right? So in the BYOD, which is kind of what I have a screenshot of here, although a little one, is the user launches that BYOD enrollment, or if it's autopilot, the autopilot device is turned on and accesses the internet and it starts the process, right? So that's the entry point, but the behavior between the two is kind of similar. So at this point, the device talks to Microsoft, and again, it sees that it has an autopilot profile assigned to it. That autopilot profile points the device at the FileWave MDM server. This is where things deviate then from the way things work with Apple and the similar program, is that a Microsoft MDM client is configured to talk to the FileWave server. That Microsoft MDM client, which the name of it escapes me right now, is included on Windows 10 devices. This configuration is configuring that client to talk to your FileWave server, right? So it talks to the FileWave server, and from there, our pre-configured FileWave client is also deployed then via an MDM command. So when we're talking about parallel management here, we're literally, in this case, talking about parallel management because there are two clients, which is a little bit different than some of the other frameworks that we work with, where Google is always the API in the middle, and you never talk directly to the device at all, and the device never talks to you. In the Apple framework, we talk to Apple, Apple talks to device, device talks to us. Here in the Microsoft environment, we actually do talk directly to the device in two ways, both through the FileWave client and through the Microsoft MDM client. So that's kind of just from a high level how some of these components work. All right, so what you're probably wondering now is, oh, it sounds great, Tony, but what's coming, when is it coming, and what are you doing after that? Right, all those things are pertinent, so let's go through that. So near-term roadmap, FileWave's first iteration of Windows MDM is nearing code completion now over the next couple of weeks. And this will be in version 14.4. So our QA process and early adopter program should lead to a general release in the May timeframe, give or take a couple of weeks, depending on how testing goes and whether it all goes smoothly or we have issues and need to address and adjust or whatever. That's why it's always a little bit fuzzy. But we're looking at a May timeframe for release of this. But the actual code is being completed right now. Over the next couple of weeks. So we have quite an extensive QA process that we go through to try to validate everything and make sure everything's working before we release it. But we're looking at May for this. What is in it? What's going to be in that release? FileWave integration with Azure AD, right? So that's the first thing, is that we simply need to be able to allow the FileWave server to talk to Azure AD for MDM purposes. So that will be there. Device enrollment through Autopilot and manual device enrollment will be possible. Although you may not care, depending on what you want to do in the short term, you may not care about devices that are in the field, at least for the initial enrollment part. It all depends on what you want to do. So that will be something for us to evaluate in each of your environments. Both of those options include automatic deployment of that custom FileWave client, right? So as I mentioned, when that enrollment happens, if the device is in autopilot, it gets the FileWave client, so you can stop worrying about deploying the FileWave client either in an image or through GPL. Okay. This release will also include the building and deployment. Right? You saw the editor in the previous screenshot of basic CSPs. And when we say basic CSPs, we're talking about the most used ones. Things like a BitLocker encryption policy, Wi-Fi setup, password policies, restrictions, wallpaper profiles, some of the highest level ones, the most used ones will be included. And that's moving pretty quickly, although there's 1,000 of them. So we're doing them as fast as we can, but we'll have a number of them in this first release. And then the basic MDM commands, the most important one is device reset. That autopilot reset that we talked about before will allow us to push a device back to that out of box experience. And that one's really important to us. And for sure, also device lock. Okay. And as I mentioned, that device reset and the double kick a device back to autopilot. The little asterisk there, meaning, of course, the device has to already be in autopilot. We're going to at least touch on that here a little bit. The longer term roadmap, though, right? So if we go back to that slide for a second, again, this is 14.4. We mentioned earlier, if you weren't on, that there won't be a 14.3. So 14.2 will be going to beta here very shortly. 14.4 will release sometime in the May timeframe, May-ish, we'll call it. So this will be 14.4. What's coming after that? What are we looking after that? No version specific information at this point on these, but this is the order in which we intend to work on things. We're going to be continuing to build on this platform continually, right? So we've started this and there's no going away from it. We're continually owning the MDM platforms, just like we do for Apple and Google already. So any changes that Microsoft's making, we're going to be keeping up with Microsoft, but then we've got some other stuff to do too, to catch up to where things are. So specifically, over the next few months, we're going to be working on BitLocker encryption key escrow. That's different than the BitLocker I mentioned on the tab on the sheet before, which was about just setting a policy to make a device encrypt. This is about actually escrowing that encryption key in FileWave itself. We're looking at additional MDM commands, other things in the framework that we've not included. Additional CSPs, that is additional configuration profiles. We have kind of a list that we're working on, but this is where, you know, when we implement this and you get, start getting this in your hands, we'd love to know from you what your favorites are, because there's a lot of them to do and we can certainly prioritize the ones that are needed more. So we'd really like your voice on what those are. And after that, so those three things are kind of the next block that we'll be working on. But after that, the general things that we'll be working on roughly in this order are Windows Update Management through MDM. You may have read about these. The term that Microsoft uses for this are update rings. So we're going to be looking at that to allow some more flexibility for Windows Update. We're going to be looking at that device compliance aspect that we talked about, which is, hey, my device needs to have antivirus, for instance, or a password policy set before it can access certain applications. And then we're going to look at application distribution, such as the Windows Store and Easy of 365 distribution. All right, last thing before we go to Q&A, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. And I really mean, when I say this is an untested item of general interest, this really is an untested item of general interest, but I think gives you an idea for how useful this can be for your day-to-day environment now, even if you're not leveraging anything with profiles or anything else on the Windows side. The MDM integration is actually very flexible because of that hybrid mode approach that we're taking with the FileWave clients. So if you think about a scenario where you've got existing devices in the field, you don't necessarily need to have those in Azure AD already to leverage Windows MDM. So let's consider a scenario. You've got devices in the field, but they're not in autopilot, right? So we can't send that whole wipe command to them, and there is a PowerShell command for doing that, but we can't send that wipe to them, because if we did, when they come back up, they're not in autopilot, so Microsoft doesn't know where to go. But we can deploy a custom field PowerShell script to get the hardware hash for autopilot. If you remember before, I said that you could bring devices into autopilot on your own. There's a script that does this, generates this huge hash that uniquely identifies the device. This, I've just run it here on one individual device, but we can do that in a custom field in PowerShell within FileWave to capture that information for every Windows device that's in your environment. Then we can create a report from that of that custom field for all devices. Us then is a CSV that actually gives us a CSV, and that whole CSV can then be uploaded into the Microsoft Autopilot portal. So we can directly then inject all the devices that we have, and in kind of one fell swoop, get them in the autopilot. And again, I'm going to say this is untested right now, but that is in theory possible to get all of those devices in there. So they're all in autopilot. Once we have them in autopilot, now we can actually send them that PowerShell script to do that autopilot reset, which is technically in PowerShell called do wipe method. It's an MDM specific command, but we can send that command to the devices. That will erase customer data, erase applications, and push that device back to an out-of-box experience. So even without starting with Windows MDM, we can actually leverage some of these things to get us to a place where maybe we don't care about Windows imaging anymore, which is not a hard place for many of us to imagine. It's kind of like nirvana to think about not having to worry about taking master images and the amount of time that imaging takes. It's not necessarily difficult, but it takes a lot of time. And so we can build workflows then to pick up from Autopilot. It picks it up, gets a FileWave client, and then we've got all our automated workflows to do all of our software deployment and assign devices to smart groups and all that stuff. So it's entirely possible through this process to have no more imaging, and that would be a pretty good place to be. So is this entirely proven? No. Are these the exact steps that we would do to do this? Maybe, maybe not. But I can tell you that we will absolutely have some documentation on doing these things so that you can get your devices in Autopilot. So even without initially doing that MDM enrollment for the devices that are in the field, you can start to leverage it. Okay. So with that, that's kind of the end of the presentation part of this. But we want you to take your turn and feel free to ask questions. Dave's here to answer them as well, both myself and Dave. So Emma, do we have anything?
Yep, there are two questions in the chat. The first one being, actually there's three now. Sorry, I just lost my place. Office 365 is your integration, how it works with Windows MDM. Just Jeff is wondering if it will work with Mac OS as well. The licensing.
I'm not sure how that part's applicable, but I'll take a look at it. I don't know is the answer to that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure as well. So
I'm glad we could be of help there, Jeff. Any other questions?
Yeah. Josh's question, would the CSPs be the sort of thing that could be generated elsewhere and imported if you don't have a mechanism to be created yet? So the short answer to that is no. They use a new markup language from Microsoft, a relatively new markup language from Microsoft. So we'd have to create an importer. However, there is a provision to take ADMX policies that you can export from if you're using SCCM or group policy, and you can export as ADMX and deploy an ADMX backed profile via MDM. So one of our enhancements down the road, not in the initial release, but will be to allow you guys to upload an ADMX backed profile and then deploy that out. So for those of you that were early on the MDM side for Apple on the Mac side, we'll remember something similar for deploying MCX based profiles via MDM. I believe that this is the same sort of intention here, is to allow extremely complicated ADMX profiles to be deployed via MDM until the MDM profile options are up to speed. I see another question there about Windows. Oh, sorry, Emma, go ahead.
No, you're fine. I was just going to probably the same one you. It's only compatible with Windows 10, correct?
Yes. Yep. That's correct. Windows 10 only.
To the question on Windows imaging, I haven't heard any kind of rumor of Microsoft attempting to kill that or anything, and I don't think that would be easy for them to do because Apple controls the hardware and the OS, where Microsoft doesn't control the hardware. So it would be very difficult for them to make a move like Apple did. However, I think it is a sign that Microsoft understands that it's difficult to do imaging in that way. And so at least it's giving the option of going with a non-monolithic way of doing that imaging. But it does, as we mentioned at the prerequisites before this, it does require Azure AD. You have to have Windows MDM and all that stuff implemented to be able to make use of this. But I think it's a really good additional option, at least.
Yeah, and I just want to address Stanley's question because it's actually points to a larger difference. So the direct answer, Stanley asked if we could facilitate things such as device name change via the FileWave client. Obviously, we have functionality for doing something similar to that, but on the MDM side, I do want to specify this is one of the differences between setting up your autopilot in using Intune, using the Intune back version of autopilot, versus using the Microsoft Store for Business version of autopilot. So that's an option that allows you to set up autopilot without Intune, but it does not allow you a lot of additional features, such as naming, conventions, and other things that can be set. If you have the Intune license as part of your Microsoft license already, then your autopilot options are enhanced significantly. And what you can do during that onboarding stage is enhanced. Now, like Tony mentioned, the API for us being able to set those settings is still a private API, which means we can assume that at some point Microsoft will open it up for us to use in our product. But right now we can only use it for testing. We're not allowed to provide it to you guys to enable. So down the road, we hope that we will have a lot more options for autopilot. But that's going to be a Microsoft decision.
Anything that we've missed in here? And yes, to the question on Windows 10, it's only Windows 10. Well, technically, it's not only Windows 10. It's also Windows 8 if you have some Windows 8. But so I think we can all agree it's just Windows 10. So let's see, what else?
Oh, and for that wipe question, Tony, yeah, I think you've messed with that one too, but I think there's two wipe options. So one is an autopilot reset, which I believe keeps everything and basically resets the device to be set up by a new user. And then the full wipe is the full-on BitLocker wipe, like take everything away and start from scratch. So.
And some of it, and I have to be, totally honest here, some of it's going to require us testing us as we build out our knowledge base articles, because none of those things happen magically. We go through and do all the stuff and play with all the iterations as we build out knowledge base articles to support it. So we'll definitely have information on all that as we go forward. All right. Well, thank you everyone for this. I'm not sure, we do have another session coming up. I think it's in a different Ring Central. That's correct?
Yes, it's in a different meeting.
Okay, so we're gonna, hopefully everybody will join us over there, but we're gonna hop over and we're gonna hopefully do something fun in a Plan B kind of way. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.